Hello there and welcome to the 4th episode of the Foxhole. In today's episode, I'll be looking into involvement versus automation, which is the topic of how games make us participate in their systems and elements. My name is Foxhound, and without further dilly-dally, let's get started. In episode 3, I talked about how the dynamic and tumultuous relationship between micro and macro was ultimately about the type and degree of control they presented to the player. Today's topic is about control, not from the perspective of micro, but rather from the decisions that the game mechanics allow you to make or not make. As I was writing the script for this video, I discovered that the topic of involvement has many faces. These are different takes on how the final gaming experience is affected and exactly why that is. First up is my love for civilization games. There's just something about the hex-based open-ended possibilities of settling the world and establishing your dominance. One of the games that also captured this essence is Galactic Civilizations 3 or GalCiv. The thing that ruined GalCiv for me, however, was their 100% auto-resolve combat system. You might be asking that if I don't like the auto-resolve combat of GalCiv, why is it then okay for Civilization to do it? Because Civilization has quite a significant ace up its sleeve. While GalCiv separates the combat system from the rest of the game, Civilization involves it directly. Here you don't go to an isolated combat screen where the units, positions and actions are unique to that screen and where nothing outside of the combat matters at that moment. Instead, Civilization is like one huge, seamless game of chess where units are both created and killed on the same board. This, combined with the utilization of the terrain in a major way, creates a lot of tactical decision making for the player to engage in. Because there is no barrier between the combat system and everything else you do in the game, you could say that combat in Civilization is always potentially occurring. This means that trade routes, resource harvesting and many other aspects are always at risk of being directly affected by the combat system, and as such you can't separate it from the rest of the game. For these reasons, a game like Civilization 5 actually involves the player a great deal in the combat, even though the actual execution of the system is technically auto-resolve. Earlier I mentioned how GalCiv separates the combat system from the rest of the game, but this in itself isn't a bad thing. The bad thing, in my very personal opinion, is that I as the player felt excluded from this section of the game. This feeling was very much compounded by the fact that the game encourages you to customize your fleet through the shipbuilder. That's an editor where you can build your very own ships, decide what weapons and gear they come equipped with. In fact, different types of weapons and armor did add some depth to the combat system, but this was nowhere near enough for my taste. And that's just it. Taste. The guys at Stardock stated that they very intentionally implemented the 100% auto-resolve combat system in the game because they wanted the focus to be on the rest of the game. It all comes down to personal preference, and even though I realize this, it still leaves me unsatisfied. As such, I wanted to explore what can be done about it, but first we have to question why it is that Stardock chose not to have a more involving combat system in the first place. Now, when it comes to the combat system of space games, there are lots of ways to do it, and there isn't one best way of doing it. For all the complaining I do about GalCiv's auto-resolve, I can easily predict how I wouldn't necessarily like an extremely player-involved combat system either, because when you make something like that, you change the type of skill that the player needs to succeed. For instance, if you're very good at fast-paced RTS games like StarCraft, you're most likely going to have an easier time duking it out in a real-time combat session, where you have to position your units, do flanking maneuvers, broadside bombardments, and so on. If you as the developer wanted to highlight the turn-based strategic element, however, opting for a combat system that requires no skill at all suddenly seems like the better option. I do think, however, that GalCiv could have had a very reasonable compromise inspired by existing game systems, so I will mention just a couple to make a point. The most important thing would probably be to make the combat turn-based, so that any solution would still complement the overall strategic skill focus of the game. Given that there is no real terrain in space, I wouldn't opt for the chessboard type of seamless combat that I mentioned earlier with Civilization, so a separate combat screen it is. Units can move around on a hex-based grid like a regular Civ game, in accordance to how the rest of GalCiv is also based on such a grid. You could also have them move around in freeform, like the miniatures in a wargame. You would then give them orders which would be executed in the span of 10 real-time seconds, after which the game would pause for new orders. Choosing one of these would go a long way to facilitate player involvement and the tactical decision making that I mentioned earlier. One of the reasons that such a factor has such a positive impact on the gaming experience is that, much like in Company of Heroes, it allows you to overcome certain situations where the odds are against you. And just like in Company of Heroes, that means that it's not necessarily the guy with the biggest army who wins the battle, and that's a pretty cool concept. There's another form of involvement that I want to talk about. This one is actually turned on its head, where I will argue that automation in this case is a good thing. The name of this contradictory term is save scumming, which is the act of saving a game often and reloading every time something bad happens. Now, the manual save system originated as a service to players, allowing them to save progress so they wouldn't have to complete the game in one go. I know some games like Prince of Persia were actually designed to be completed in one session, and while that's also a cool concept, I will be talking about the huge majority of games that aren't part of that niche. Okay, so, being able to resume a saved game another time is all well and good, but the problem is that we players are human, and humans for the most part will indulge in cheating if it's not discouraged. That cheating manifests itself in the form of save scumming, and I should know because I used to do it a lot. I'm not saying gamers do the evil finger pyramid of plotting while petting their complimentary white cat when they cheat. It's more a matter of the game not setting enough boundaries, so save scumming becomes convenient for not risking all your hard-earned progress. You end up thinking, well, I'm able to do it, might as well go ahead then. But why is cheating a problem anyway? Can't we just leave the player be? Well, in the case of save scumming, I don't think so, because it dilutes the whole gaming experience. If the game is predicated on high risk, high reward, like the XCOM franchise, and you then dilute that risk, then you're left with risks without consequences, which aren't risks at all. These consequences of failure that you're supposed to experience, they are the ones that elevate your success stories to such an incredibly satisfying level, because the more suffering and hardship you endure, the more valuable the good times feel. In real life, we have laws that discourage us from cheating, but games can't convict us and send us to jail. The road to redemption, then, is not actual redemption, but rather total prevention. If the developer takes away the player's immediate ability to cheat, then the game can deliver the intended experience, which is a win-win situation. I said I used to save scum, and at one time I tried a mod for XCOM that included an Iron Man mode. This is when the game is auto-saved constantly and the manual save system is disabled. I suddenly found the game to be much more satisfying, and I never want to go back as a result. What I also found, however, is that I will go back to doing that if the game allows me to. You could tell me just to grow a spine and refrain from save scumming, but that's a shallow remark that might as well be said about junk food and most other temptations in life. Sure, maybe you're some kind of hardcore achiever with a willpower of steel and the discipline of a feudal samurai, but players in general are just mere mortals, so let's design our games with that in mind. Yet another aspect of the involvement theme in this episode is one of player choice. In Company of Heroes 1, you didn't just get the choice of commander, but commander abilities were divided into two paths, where you had to choose which to go down first, or to alternate between them. This was a great example of involvement that forced you to think about your situation in the game, but in Company of Heroes 2, this element was completely removed. Instead, Steel Soldiers, they disposed with the concept of factories that would just spit out units. Instead, you could now construct buildings and units per request, and all this cost resources, much like a typical RTS of its time. But the automation element was the thing that made the original game so special, and where the extra involvement of the player now is to the detriment of the experience. By the same token, if Majesty was suddenly converted to giving the player control over his units, that would also be an example of more involvement being a bad thing. This is weird because my initial hypothesis was that involvement is good, and there are plenty of examples of that, but because there are also examples of the polar opposite being true, we have to craft a new theory. At first I thought, instead, the macro element of the game has been almost completely automated, and so the only thing you have to focus on is all the micro, and that's why automation is okay. But then I remembered that while Majesty also uses the lack of involvement as a good thing, it's the micro that's automated there, not the macro. This made me think about the point that I made in episode 3, that all of this is an attention allocation issue. But I realized that the examples I gave for involvement being good are not about the same thing as the examples for it being bad. The automation in Set and Majesty are just unique versions of the relationship between micro and macro, which is something I didn't realize in episode 3. The commander ability paths in Company of Heroes, however, was a purely good aspect because it made the player think more without requiring extra attention. And I think that's the heart of the issue, because let's remember, actually selecting the path to go down takes only a few seconds. But weighing your options and integrating them into your tactics leads to innovating your overall strategy. And this is something you can spend a lot of time on outside the game. To me, that's the perfect symptom of a great game, one that makes you think about it endlessly when you're not even playing. Thank you so much for watching. Do you have a favorite game that does player involvement in a really unique way? Tell me in a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, drop me a like. If you want more of these videos, do subscribe. And if you'd like to support me, you can donate on PayPal. See you next time.